Months of struggle, increasing concern, and a couple of painful races conducting very public experiments had threatened to derail Aston Martin's F1 season. But now Fernando Alonso has burst back onto the podium in fighting fashion. His team can and did breathe a sigh of relief after a sudden turnaround in form and fortune. You don't have to dig back far into our channel's archives to find in-depth videos on how badly in decline Aston Martin's season has been. Alonso's third place on merit in Brazil has injected some much needed end-of-year positivity. With Lance Stroll backing him up in fifth, Aston Martin's 25-point haul from this weekend was more than it had managed across the last 6. But it wasn't just a lovely points haul, it was a real podium, earned by being much more competitive over one lap and in the race than Aston Martin has probably been for months. The deficit to race winner Max Verstappen was significantly reduced and more than halved compared to some of the recent miserable Grand Prix the team has endured. Yes, Ferrari and Mercedes underperformed and Sergio Perez's Red Bull started out of position, but this wasn't just Alonso slipping into a gap that others opened up. He and Stroll were faster than most rivals, and this was the kind of result that wouldn't have looked out of place in the first third of the season, when everyone was raving about Aston Martin being a leading team. In fact, Alonso actually finished closer to the winner than he did way back in the season opener in Bahrain. Okay, it was nothing like the peak of Canada, where the Aston Martin was clearly the second fastest car and had Alonso thinking a win might not be far around the corner, but this was clearly a deserved front-running performance, not one handed to it by misfiring rivals. It was something the team needed after getting out-developed, losing its way, then looking worse than ever as it brought some ideas relevant for 2024 that didn't seem to be working in terms of performance. The obvious question is how the hell this turnaround happened so suddenly. Aston Martin seemed to be scratching its heads for a while as upgrades either weren't working well enough or were causing new problems. There was a mix of 2023 focused performance upgrades and ideas designed to guide the 2024 direction, and the big gamble was when Aston Martin brought its final major change to the sprint weekend in the US. This seemed to throw the team into a more confused state. Both drivers were unhappy about how the car handled, and debuting a new floor at a sprint event meant little track time to assess and fine-tune the package. That prompted the drastic approach for the US Grand Prix itself of committing both cars to a pit lane start, splitting the car specifications with Stroll keeping the new floor and Alonso reverting to the old one and making significant setup adjustments too. This resulted in a better race day performance, but there were no such silver linings in Mexico, where Aston Martin split the car specs again, with Stroll using the old floor and Alonso using the new one. Both cars retired at the end of a miserable, uncompetitive weekend in which Alonso uncharacteristically spun twice and both drivers bemoaned a total lack of grip and confidence. Despite that, senior figures remained steadfast that Aston Martin hadn't got lost and that the situation wasn't, as it seemed to be, a complete disaster. They felt they'd banked 2 compromised weekends of data collection that had just made it very difficult for the team at the track to optimise the car during the weekend. This all amounted to a bit too much R&D work in front of everybody, to quote performance director Tom McCulloch, who said in hindsight it wasn't the right thing to do. But the reward was 2 races worth of comparative data and finally re-establishing a good understanding of the car on track. That's what led to Brazil, where Aston Martin didn't conduct any live experiments through the event, it just rocked up with a clear car specification and built from there. What exactly that car spec was, Aston Martin was a little coy on. It effectively mixed and matched some parts of the upgrade and some of what existed previously. McCulloch says this is actually standard practice for this team through the season, depending on the demands of each circuit. There is still a belief that some parts of the recent upgrade did not work as well as hoped, which is in keeping with some other recent development disappointments, and that means there's still a key question mark over the team, which we'll come to shortly. But by establishing the best spec of car for Brazil and making it work, Aston Martin has at least proved it does understand where things went wrong this season and crucially was actually capable of addressing it on this car. That confusion, frustration, or whatever you want to call it while working through the recent development dilemma was a key factor in why several key team figures, including Alonso, admitted the Brazil showing was a big relief. Aston Martin is still extremely unlikely to rebound and reclaim 4th in the championship from McLaren, having been caught and overhauled with ease during its competitive freefall. But there has been an admission for some time that the team did need to end this year on a high to avoid a very successful season, especially compared to 2022 being overshadowed by a limp finish. The desperate need for something like this was already evident after qualifying in Brazil when Stroll was a shock 3rd and Alonso backed him up in 4th. Even then, team boss Mike Crack said that after a brutal triple header with big expectations and no results so far, this was fantastic and a relief to come back a little bit. Then Alonso turned that into a podium in the Grand Prix itself, and Stroll recovered from a difficult start to finish 5th, and the full extent of just how timely the performance and result were started to become clear. Alonso stood by his team for the most part during its decline and tended to lean on the positives. But he has now admitted the team's been struggling for a few months, and the painful previous 2 races in particular had left him concerned for the rest of the year and probably for 2024 as well. But that is no longer the case, not just because the car was suddenly quick again, but because a couple of things have been understood inside the team, which have given it a better development and setup direction. It worked as well in Brazil as Aston Martin hoped, and now Alonso's super excited for what might be possible in the final couple of races as well. As he said, it's a very different energy when you have a performing car, and that will go for everyone at Aston Martin. The part of all this positivity that has a caveat is at some point Aston Martin must confront what hasn't worked with its upgrades. If what it brought to Austin was about guiding a development direction for 2024, then regardless of how common mixing and matching specs supposedly is, it must be slightly problematic that not everything new has stayed on the car. Especially as it fits with the trend of Aston Martin being disappointed that its upgrades haven't delivered more this season. Whether this is just some careful messaging or not, the line from the team is that the Austin Mexico upgrade evaluation work really was about exploring ideas and gathering data for 2024, not just about an instant performance step. McCulloch has described what was most experimental about the Austin upgrade as the team wanting to really push the boundaries in some areas of the floor, which is understood to primarily be around the floor edges. This will almost certainly relate to the complex relationship between the powerful ground effect aero and the car's mechanical platform, and Aston Martin trying to enhance its understanding of that. Like all teams, Aston Martin's been trying to adapt its knowledge and methodologies in the wind tunnel and in CFD development based on the sensitivities of these cars. This means understanding how to get maximum performance without triggering porpoising and how the car produces its aerodynamic load. And McCulloch has admitted that Aston Martin has had to do some pretty extreme things to help correlate the simulation tools. He says that's why there have been a lot of aero rakes on the car at times, which serves as a clear example of just how much data collecting Aston Martin has been doing in Grand Prix weekends. It's way too convenient for a team to brush off disappointing performances with a bit of yeah we're using races as test sessions. But McCulloch is adamant that Aston Martin has gained a good understanding of the way to develop the car for next year. The fact they've stuck to the story after being so bad in Austin and Mexico and then supporting their words with actions in Brazil leaves us inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt. But given this is just one race, we're also going to leave an asterisk against their development confidence for next year's car. This year or next year, a good Aston Martin is only useful if its driver is getting the most out of it. Both did that in Brazil, but a vintage Alonso display was a big reminder of just how important he is to Aston Martin. Holding off the much faster Red Bull of Sergio Perez for almost the entire Grand Prix, then stunningly repassing him on the final lap, had everything, and left Perez summing up Alonso perfectly, with Fernando will always try to play any game, but it'll always be fair. There were indeed some games in this race, but nothing untoward. Just Alonso being clever, tactical, stubborn Alonso. Overtaking Lewis Hamilton on the first lap of the restart was what Alonso said changed his race, as it let him control his pace and extend his opening stint while also building a gap to Perez, who took a lot longer to get by the 2 Mercedes drivers. That gave him a decent buffer and allowed Alonso to keep his tyres in good condition for when Perez inevitably caught him, and when that happened in the final stint, Alonso was a real menace. He used his clear air advantage to keep just clear enough in the last corners not to be a sitting duck on the start-finish straight, which he would save his battery for as well, and also varied his lines to confuse Perez and try to generate more turbulent air. Eventually, the Red Bull's advantage told, and on the penultimate lap, Perez finally blasted past on the run to the first corner. But Alonso somehow kept close enough to fight back on the final lap, pressure Perez into a small mistake, and take advantage. Alonso doubted that finishing third by half a tenth was his best podium of 2023, but it was probably the hardest earned, and in the context of the last couple of months, the most valuable for Aston Martin since it shocked so many people all the way back at the first race in Bahrain.